The following is the story The Samurai Who Couldn't Die, a Tales from the Storm entry from Final Fantasy XIV Chronicles of Light. This is a book only or book exclusive story. The illustration shown here was provided by the book illustrator Toshiyuki Itahana, and it features Gosetsu. And so we begin. By your leave, Gosetsu lowered himself down somewhat gingerly next to a weathered skull, crossing his aching legs as he glanced about the surrounding field. Since shaving his head and setting off on a pilgrimage to honor the fallen, the former samurai's winding road had led him to the border of Ilsabard. It was here, some 2 decades past, that a battle had raged between the forces of the Empire and the peoples of subjugated province. The remains of the vanquished still lay unburied, discolored bones protruding from the undulating sea of wild grass. I know not who you were, friend, nor yet for whom you fought, but I do know you were a warrior. Rogadin paused politely, as if affording the skull time to respond. When he did not, he continued. Here you lie, mouldering away with none to mourn your passing, while this old man clings shamelessly to life. And yet in my defense none could say that I have not afforded the Kami ample opportunity to claim this tired soul. It had been 25 years since his first appointment with death. Gosetsu had fought like a demon against the invading empire, but even a man of his indomitable will could not prevail against the might of Garlemald. Defeated, both he and his Lord Kion were taken prisoner, their beloved Doma falling at last to imperial rule. Disgraced and dishonored by his capture, the breaking of his spirit was completed by the news of his family's fate. His wife and daughter had perished during the imperial bombardment of Monzen. In dedicating every waking moment to his liege, Gosetsu had all but left his spouse to run their household alone, and on no few occasions had he come home to find his 5-year-old asleep in the doorway where she had waited to welcome her father's return. He had often considered begging leave from his duties that he might spend time with his loved ones, but now even that humble wish would never be granted. Robbed of his will to live, Gosetsu thought only of being reunited in death. His life, however, was not his own to take. Unable to beg Kion's consent, the samurai was forced to endure the agony of his imprisonment. 6 moons waxed and waned before one day, without warning, the guard strode into his cell and dragged him from his meager bedding. Wordlessly they led him to a nearby chamber, wherein waited Doma's former ruler. It seemed their captors had at last permitted Kion a visitor, but rather than ask for his beloved wife, he had requested to speak with his most loyal retainer. Even as the door closed behind him, Gosetsu fell to his knees and begged for the right to commit seppuku. But Kion simply closed his eyes and shook his head. Why? Gosetsu rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse. Why do you deny me this small mercy? Kion was not only his master, but his oldest and dearest friend. Rarely did the samurai question his lord's decisions, but in the face of this unfeeling refusal he could not conceal his dismay. Our nation has fallen. My family is dead. I failed to protect all that is dear to me. Honor demands that I turn my blade. I need you alive, came the reply, silencing Gosetsu at a stroke. I trust no other to watch over my son. None. This was the first Gosetsu had heard of an heir. In the pandemonium which followed the Empire's invasion, Kion explained he had told no one that his wife Mina was with child, a boy if the predictions of the Onmyoji were to be believed. The revelation left Gosetsu agog. To himself he thought, he will come into a world of strife and subjugation. If I do not stand at his side, then who will? Tears welling in his eyes, the samurai withdrew his earlier request, and swore to his liege a new oath. He would not fail this time. So it was that my first death was denied, Gosetsu explained to his mute audience. His son Shun was born soon after, and I was conscripted to fight the Empire's battles for them, to draw a blade in service of another, of our hated enemy no less, was a humiliation worse than dying. But such was the price of remaining true to my oath. I turned my heart to stone and carved a bloody trail with my steel. Full many fell before me, some on this very battlefield. Gosetsu regarded the skull sympathetically. Were you one of them? I understand if your spirit chose to haunt me. Such terrible deeds I performed in the name of honor. Hollow eye sockets stared back at him, but no vengeful spectre stirred within their depths. The old Rogodan plunged onwards with his recollections. Which brings me to the recent uprising and what should have been my second death. It was the 24th winter of the imperial occupation. Lord Kyne had been permitted to retake his place as Doma's leader, a puppet made to dance to Gralmald's tune. His wife Mina, meanwhile, had passed away, the long years of anguish taking their toll. As for the young Shun, he had grown into an exceptional warrior, taking the name Hien following his coming-of-age ceremony. And Gosetsu himself had returned to serve House Regent, playing up old wounds as a means to escape further service on the front lines. Though each gave the impression of a man resigned to his fate, the truth could not have been more different. In secret, the trio had spent countless nights plotting Doma's liberation, going so far as to establish a base of resistance in the House of the Fierce. And yet, after almost a quarter of a century of imperial rule, the time to rise up seemed no closer. But then word arrived that the emperor had succumbed to old age, and that a war of succession was brewing in Garlemald. The kami themselves could not have presented a better opportunity. Waiting patiently until the local garrison had been dispatched to join the conflict back in the motherland, Gosetsu led a rebel force to lay siege to Doma Castle, and after a brief battle both it and the viceroy lay in Doman hands. Yet as swiftly as their victory had come, still more swiftly came the empire's retribution. The internecine struggle within the capital was resolved sooner than any had thought possible, and reinforcements dispatched to Domo forthwith. Arriving at the head of the 12th Legion, the newly anointed emperor's own son, the Crown Prince Zenos, fell upon the rebels like a tidal wave. Overwhelmed, Gosetsu abandoned the castle to the flood of imperial troops, seeking at least to uphold his word by ensuring Hien's survival. They had scarcely reached safety when they learned of Lord Kyne's fate. While attempting to coordinate the evacuation of his people, Doma's ruler was confronted by Zenos and slain in single combat. I will avenge him, Gosetsu vowed then, even should mine own life be the price of vengeance. Gripping the hilt of his katana, the grief-maddened samurais prepared to charge into the enclave where the 12th had set up camp, only for Hien to bar his path. I share your grief at father's passing, the young man said, his expression stern. But we must pull back and await our next chance of freedom. I am your lord now, he continued, not unkindly, and I order you to withdraw. For a moment, Gosetsu's body went rigid, but then he allowed his hand to fall away from his weapon. His liege and closest friend was dead. Caring not who might be watching, he fell to his knees and wept. And thus was Underworld denied my eternal soul once more. I ask you, what manner of samurai lives to tell the tale of his lord's demise? A rueful grin spread across Gosetsu's broad features. One would be forgiven for questioning my loyalties. Shaking his head, he let out a deep sigh. Where was I? Yes. Following our defeat, we were compelled to remain ever on the move, striking at our enemy whenever the opportunity arose. But while evading some particularly persistent pursuers, we became separated. I searched, of course. Oh, how I searched! But my liege was nowhere to be found, and so I left for yours to enlist the aid of Yugiri Miss Walker. To cut a long story short, Gosetsu went on cheerfully, we were eventually reunited with our young lord, at whose side we marched upon Doma Castle once more. And 'twas there that I came to stare into the eyes of death for the third time. Our foe, you see, foreseeing our victory, had made arrangements to bring the keep down on our heads. Yet even as the masonry crumbled around me, I was content to perish and the knowledge that Lord Hien was safe in Doma free. 'Twould have been a good end, mayhap the best. But once again, the kami proved reluctant to grant me my final rest. Gosetsu had awoken to find himself drifting down the one river, atop a stout wooden door whose twisted hinges had chanced to snag upon his sleeve. Nor was he alone. By some miracle, Yotsuyu, too, had been spared. Yet, despite his hatred for the viceroy, he could not strike at her as she lay there senseless. Instead, he spent his strength on keeping their precarious raft from tipping as the current carried them out into the open sea. They washed up on the beach of a small island, where Yotsuyu at last regained consciousness. She seemed confused by the situation, unable even to recall her own name. Gosetsu naturally suspected trickery, but when he advanced upon her, blade drawn, she dissolved into fits of frightened weeping. In that moment he saw not the viceroy, but the face of his lost little girl, cheeks streaked with tears after a scolding. The point of his katana dropped into the sand. He could no more cut her down than he could his own daughter. So began their time as castaways. What would have been torture for some, surviving on rainwater and the few fish that could be caught, seemed to Gosetsu a tranquil dream after a lifetime of conflict. Yotsuyu spoke to him as an honored grandfather, seeking his approval with an innocence that touched his heart. And as affection blossomed unbidden, he in turn began thinking of her as a grandchild. The spiteful woman he had once cursed as his foe gradually ceased to be. Ayami, is that who I am? One morning, still drowsy from sleep, Gosetsu had mistaken the wide-eyed Yotsuyu for his long-dead daughter. Stricken with guilt, he had then resolved to make a conscious effort to call her Suyu. Yet the similarity could not be denied. Had Ayami lived, she would have been of a similar age. And just like that, Gosetsu caught himself contemplating a life on the little island and simply forgetting all that had gone before. But he was beholden to his duty. His lord must know that he and Yotsuyu had survived. And so, as soon as his wounds permitted, Gosetsu chopped down their sanctuary's solitary tree, fashioned a crude raft, and began paddling toward the nearest shore. My reunion with Lord Hien was joyous enough, but I must confess my heart was filled with trepidation, the old brigand said softly. I feared what judgment he would pronounce on Tsuyu. But my liege is a merciful man, and he granted her leave to live among us as a Doman citizen until such time as her memories returned. In my elation, I convinced myself that everything that had come to pass, our miraculous survival, my inability to wield a blade, was a sign from the kami that I was destined to spend the rest of my days at Tsuyu's side. Fond fool, that I of all men should presume to understand the will of the divine. Gosetsu stared into the distance, eyes clouded with anguish. Sure enough, Yotsuyu's true self returned, her crimes inviting an inevitable death. Tsuyu was gone, and I was left to mourn once more. His story told, he bowed his head and lapsed into silence. The skull, however, seemed unmoved. Marking its impassive expression, Gosetsu laughed quietly. Mine apologies. I did not come here to bore you with an old man's tales. I came to see that you and your comrades are given the proper rights. So saying, he heaved himself to his feet and began the laborious process of burying each and every bone which littered the field. That task complete, he constructed a simple cairn of stones and read aloud a passage of prayer in reverent tones. And then he collapsed. Gosetsu awoke to find himself sitting at the prow of a small ferry, enveloped in a nimbus of warm light. The craft bobbed in the waters of the broad river, and upon the far bank he could make out a small gathering of people beckoning him to cross. Squinting at their faces, he made out his wife and daughter and his dear friend Kyan, Even Tsuyu was there smiling again. Gosetsu smiled back. At long last death has come to embrace me. I shall be with thee soon, he called out, snatching up the oar lying across the vessel's bench, and starting to paddle in earnest. Yet however furiously he churned the water, the ferry would not move forward. He looked up to see the distant bank drawing even farther away. Desperate now, Gosetsu flung aside the oar and dove into the river. The next thing he knew, he felt solid ground beneath his back. A peddler, judging by his attire, was leaning over him, peering wordly into his eyes. Had yourself a bit of a turn, did you? The man asked kindly, enunciating each syllable for ease of comprehension. I have some spare food and water if you think you can stomach it. A turn, Gosetsu replied groggily. Where's Ayame? Suyu? His thoughts swirled in confusion until a rumbling growl from his belly reminded him where he was and what he had been doing. For 3 days and 3 nights he had toiled in the field, without so much as a sip of water or grain of rice passing his lips. Unsure whether to feel embarrassed or saddened by his predicament, Gosetsu resolved instead to see the mirth in it. I thought for certain my time had come, but 'twould seem the kami are not done with me yet, he chuckled. So be it. If I am to remain in this world, then I shall greet every precious moment as a dear friend. What more can a man do but smile? With a customarily ear-splitting laugh, Gosetsu took the proffered bread from the startled merchant's hands and wolfed it down in 3 hurried bites. He would need his strength if he was to continue his pilgrimage. And so marks the end of the story, The Samurai Who Couldn't Die. For those who are curious, if you continue on with your role quests in Walker, there will be more of his story. I'm not saying where, but look for it. Or as we like to say, please look forward to it.